morning, everybody. Welcome to TEFAF Coffee Talks. I am delighted to have you here this morning, as I'm sure, in fact, you're delighted to be here in expectation of this conversation. My name is Linda Lees. I'm the Director of Cultural Programming for TEFAF New York. I've had the pleasure this past week of presenting some outstanding panels. I urge you to look at all of them online. They were live streamed on Facebook and they're still there, as this one will be as well. So you can see it after in case you missed some of the golden words of wisdom from this panel, and you can also recommend it to friends and colleagues who were not able to be here this morning, so that would be terrific. I'm going to just I know we're excited to get started, so I'm going to turn it over immediately to my friend, Carrie Rebora Barratt, who, as most of you probably know by now, is President and CEO of the New York Botanical Garden.
Thank you all for being here. So I'm Carrie Barratt, since July, President and CEO of the New York Botanical Garden. Before that, I had a long career at the Met. I know Linda. Linda said my friend. I'll just tell you, I know Linda because we taught together at the Sotheby's Institute of Art years ago, became close colleagues, and I think what we learned there was we kind of threw ideas back and forth at one another. American art, art business, contemporary art. What were the conversations that we most wanted to have? And she and I began talking in preparation for this TEFAF season. To my mind, one of the most interesting things that faces all the great cultural institutions of this country, but seems New York especially, maybe because there are so many rules in this city, is the renovation practice of a historic building when a landmark structure needs to change. We could do a whole probably hour on, I think the hardest things for human beings to do is change. And in my other life tomorrow, we're actually talking about climate change. But what I want to talk about today with Ian Wardropper and Annabelle Selldorf are the sort of trials and tribulations. I'll be honest, when we started, Linda and I, talking about this panel, we could have had another panel. We could have gotten colleagues from the American Museum of Natural History and the Met and the New Museum and Dia Beacon, and really so many of our colleagues are grappling with the same kind of issues, and we'll get into those details. But I'd like to start. This is Ian Wardropper, who's been director of the Frick since 2011, a former colleague at the Met, who's done many, many exhibitions, is an expert on European sculpture and early decorative arts, very distinguished, and has been doing marvelous, marvelous things, looking at the Frick anew in all of its gravitas, in all of its integrity, but kind of looking forward to what the Frick needs to be now. And that really is what faces us all as cultural leaders. And his problem solver, partner in crime on this project, is Annabelle Selldorf, who I've known for a while too. Annabelle is the principal of her own architectural firm, Selldorf Architects, has many brilliant, sensitive projects under her belt. And I think the two of them, as we've prepared for this, the two of them comprise what I think is the essential ingredient in any project like this, and especially one where you're dealing with a landmark building, is a client-architect relationship. Who's presenting the problems? Who's solving the problems? When is dialogue created? And how compromise, resolution, and then we'll get into stakeholders in a little while. But I want to ask Ian to talk a little bit about the history of the Frick. We say that things that we think that we all know, but maybe don't. Tell us a little bit about how it became a museum and what you know. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, for moderating this. Well, let me just start by saying that what people love about the Frick, I believe, is first the quality of the collection, and then the sense of being in a house that is a private house, that is a private collection. And in the end, also the intimacy. And I hesitated on that because it's a mansion. When it was built, Henry Clay Frick told the architect, I want something simple, modest. When it opened to the public in 1915, Architecture magazine said the most costly and sumptuous house in America has been turned over to its owner. So the question of the definition of simple. But it has a sense of scale that's very private. And so those things, the quality of the exhibition, the sense of being in a private house, and the fact that it is a relatively small institution are three of the most important factors that we try to keep in mind as we are planning to make some much needed additional space to the institution. So very briefly, the history, because I find many people think they know it but don't really. The house was finished in 1914 by Carrere and Hastings for Henry Clay Frick. After he and his wife died about 1931, then the trustees invited another architect, John Russell Pope, to essentially double the space of public space. So, for example, the garden court, whenever you're in there, that was an open courtyard. Henry Clay Frick never saw that as a space. Then the museum opened to the public in 1935, and what's interesting about the history of the Frick is a long-term recognition of the need for more space to function well and to fulfill its mission. So beginning 5 years after the Frick opened to the public, so in 1940, the Frick bought the first of 3 townhouses to the east of the museum on 70th Street and spent a lot of money in 30 years buying 3 townhouses. By 1972, when they had the plot of land, which they had intended to build a 3-story building on the site where there were 3 townhouses, the 70s were not a great time financially, and so the institution pulled back and built a 1.5-story pavilion on one of the 3 sites, and put up a very beautiful garden. So there have been a number of master plans. It depends how you count, but I'd say 5 master plans since 1966 on additional space that will make the museum function better. The most recent one, 3 years ago or so, called for going back on the garden site. Many people love gardens. I'm looking at somebody who's the president of one of the great botanic gardens, and there was a lot of concern. We heard the concern and pulled back from those plans. The good news is that led us to an architectural search that eventually led us to Annabelle, who I think is really the perfect architect to work with us. We've very much enjoyed working with her. So I can talk a little bit more about the program, but why don't I throw it back to you?
Before we hear from Annabelle then, so you're going through master plans, you're the new director there in 2011, which is only 7 years ago?
A long 7 years.
A long 7 years. Just to interject, to put some context, I think that's a big vision. I think to get there and to say we're facing the digital era and our library, doesn't have enough data ports. The Frick is not accessible. Your collection has grown by half, but your gallery space, these things must be the sort of things that were on your desk when you got there. And at some point, maybe, and then we'll throw it to Annabelle, those sorts of things become a building project. But what we want to get to, too, is the end product isn't necessarily the result of a building. It's actually a visitor experience and a way of presenting your collection, right? So if you could talk about how you figured out what the Frick of the future would be.
I'll start with that, and of course we are fundamentally an art museum with a great collection. The collection has actually more than doubled since we opened to the public in 1935, and we now only show about 30% of our collection. So for many years we've wanted to have some additional space for that, and the best solution is actually a really old one, and it's the kind of core of the plan, which is to open up the second floor. That's the residential part of the house where the bedrooms were. Plans were actually drawn up in 1932. The Frick sometimes moves very deliberately, and the plans were drawn then that would be a public space. It never happened, but we're now talking about going back to that old idea, and that really is a kind of core that Annabelle is kind of working around because I think it will both give us the appropriate amount of space, the appropriate kind of space in the house, and allow our public that I'm very self-conscious when I go over the velvet rope and up the stairs, and people are wondering who is that guy and what is up there, that this is an opportunity for the public to understand how the whole house worked, both the more personal and the more public.
You've got a programmatic collection imperative, but you also have a big reveal too. Then, but maybe Annabelle, you could talk a little bit about what was the program that Ian presented to you when you came in to save the day in 2015?
Tall order. I think one of the things I particularly enjoyed is that Ian basically didn't say, do this or do that. He allowed us to get to know the museum by allowing us access everywhere. We took lots of pictures of people's offices with too much stuff in them. But all joking aside, I think it was a really interesting process to understand what works, what doesn't work. I think we were selected in the first place because we love the museum so much. To me, the Frick has been a source of great inspiration, both for the architecture that it represents. I mean, the architecture of Thomas Hastings and then John Russell Pope has always been something that I've admired very much because of the proportions, because of the intimacy. And when Ian talks about the quality of intimacy in a house, I would like to be emphatic about the word architecture in that context, because it's really, I would think, the best domestic architecture that we can find in New York City. And that matters to people just about as much as every other aspect. Maybe pictures come first, or art comes first. But anyway, in a roundabout way, just to say that the process of discovery of what works and doesn't work was, of course, aligned with the experience that everybody at the Frick has had. How you arrive, how you buy tickets, where you leave your coats, how you go around. And I think, in the first place, what was important to us is to say, let's not interfere with the beautiful circulation that is so precious to the many visitors who come over and again to the Frick, who feel that the Frick is theirs. And I felt that way. Every time I go first to the living room, visit St. Francis, and then do all the other things one has to do at the Frick. And so I think together in the last couple of years, with everybody, the curators and all the great people who work and love the Frick, the process of discovering what we need to do, how we can do it in the most discreet way, in the most supportive way, really, is what informs the overall process. And I think it is a constant dialogue. I was just saying to Ian when we said hello this morning, it was a great meeting yesterday. And I feel that it is this iterative process that makes it very good.
Can you maybe both of you say a few words about sort of the feeling of a house museum? As you're talking, Annabelle, I'm thinking about the numbers of times I have, probably a lot of you have been to the Frick, to look at pictures, but seeing them in that setting. I think about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum too. These wonderful homes where you're seeing art as if the owner just walked out the door, which is a much different thing than going to the Met or to MoMA or to a traditional museum setting. So, if I might, that character of the Frick is what I think makes it challenging to renovate, because you want to hold on to that. And for you, Annabelle, it must make you think a lot about materials, the materiality of the building. We'll just add, the special nature of a house museum is.
I think we actually just have to say we're not changing anything in the old Frick. So just to relieve everybody's anxiety, it's like people seem to think that a lot of tech metal is afoot. Not so much. Nothing in the circulation of the old house will really change.
That's absolutely true. So just to try to address your question a little bit about what is the experience of looking at art in the Frick. So Annabelle mentioned, saying a prayer to St. Francis in the Wilderness, our great Giovanni Bellini picture, but it's the whole context of the room that makes that experience unique. So there are great paintings. They're not from one culture. There's also paintings from Germany painted in England and Spain, as well as Italian pictures. There's a Persian carpet on the rug. There are Chinese porcelain. There's some of the greatest Italian Renaissance bronzes ever there. There's French 18th century Boule furniture. So it's this mix of materials that is all of the highest level of quality, but is quite a personal mix. And we have very few labels. That's something I thought about when I first arrived, but realized we need to deliver information in other ways because we need to keep the sense of this being a visit to a private collection. And just to reiterate what Annabelle said, really, we are not talking about changing the great galleries downstairs. That's really important to us. We will refresh them. And the long term, and the other aspect, we can talk about this later, is many people have been, since we announced that we're going to go to the Met Breuer for a 2-year vacation. If you think about the walls of the Met Breuer, these stark, brutalist walls, Breuer's 1966, and imagine our paintings on those walls, I think many people are very curious to see what that's like. It will focus on just the objects for themselves, but then imagine them coming back. It's the context that makes the Frick, and that's what's really so important.
Yeah, well, we can either get to that later or not if anyone's interested in the questions. We deliberately, as a threesome here, decided not to use slides. So for all of you, this is not meant to be a press conference on the Frick renovation to show you what it's going to be, but more to talk about the process. But I would love it, Annabelle, if you would talk a little bit about the experience. So the experience that none of us has ever had, although I've been to Ian's office, so I have walked up that staircase, is walking in and being able to go upstairs. And what will those galleries, how will you make those galleries look like they belong in the house? Because they're offices now. They have some original equipment, but I'm more interested in process and kind of description of materials.
Yeah, a little bit.
Again, it's an iterative process, and we've spent significant amount of time with Ian and with the curators to understand what is going to go there. For one, there is a difference in scale. So as you come up to the second floor, the rooms have less ceiling height, and they relate to the ground very differently.
They were bedrooms.
They were bedrooms, indeed. We're not going to put beds in. Right? Or have you changed your mind about that?
No, that's right.
But the rooms are beautiful, and they hold paintings, drawings, and objects in a really beautiful way. And so what we're currently working on is really what is the best sequence to make you understand that it is a house, maybe even understand that they were bedrooms, without that being the overriding idea. You're not meant to go and say, all right, this is where somebody had tea or breakfast or something.
It's not a period setting.
It's not a period setting. But the quality of the spaces by themselves is so good. And the overall circulation using that long corridor along the bedrooms is just a marvel to experience. And I think there is some in between. You don't need to know what those rooms were destined for, but just using the circulation as a device to open up the spaces is really all it needs. So I feel that we, the architects, are only following really in the footsteps of that which Ian and his team lay out to be the sort of curatorial vision. And it leads to inspired conversations about how do we light it, what are the materials on the wall. I'm currently thinking that we're just doing this. No. But it's an informed conversation that goes back and forth and doesn't start with a preemptive, it has to be this. But understanding that it is a learning process and a process to sort of one by one say, if this goes here, something else can go there. And does that describe it?
You could comment on that, but also I want to hear a little bit more about the interpretive program and how maybe education or the educational program at the Frick will not change, but match what people are looking for these days?
Sure. I think maybe I'll address that more. I mean, we are sort of actively thinking with our curatorial department about what we'll show where on the second floor, and it's a really interesting process. And you know, being away at the Met Breuer gives us an opportunity to kind of experiment with some things for that too when we return. But the point that we were making earlier is that this is a house. It was a private house that was then retrofitted as a public institution, and is the case with many institutions. You mentioned the Gardner earlier. There are many things that have been lacking, and there are many aspects of the museum that have grown over time that need to be met. And so one is the educational programs. We've only had an education department for perhaps 20 years, and we now have a really vibrant set of programs, but there are no classrooms whatsoever in the Frick. There's no place for any school children to put their backpacks. So this has been something we've really wanted for a long time, and we're creating a kind of an educational center, which will give them different spaces that are their spaces to use for different educational functions. So that's a really critical part. And you also mentioned the library earlier, and it's the digital future of the library. Not everyone knows that the Frick has one of the foremost art reference libraries in the world. And they don't know it partly because there's no connection from the museum to the library. You have to walk around the block to 71st Street to enter. So part of our goal is to have a direct connection so the public knows that this is a free and public library that anyone can use. And I think Annabelle has very adroitly used the location of the education center as the conduit that leads from the museum to the library.
So in my mind, I'm walking through the building. I'm entering the beautiful entrance on 70th Street with the garden to my right, and then I'll be able to find my way back, actually walking a city block.
That's right.
Through galleries, then upstairs to find this. If you haven't, how many of you have used the library at the Frick? Yeah, probably lots of you here. I mean, it's just
more people here.
It's one of the most extraordinary research places, aside from the collection that you have. It just makes you want to be a scholar when you're there. Beautiful light.
Yeah, but it's both a traditional and a forward-looking library in the sense that more than a quarter of its holdings are unique in what's called the World Cat library system. You cannot find it anywhere else in the world, so there will always be a need for it as a kind of museum of books and manuscripts. But at the same time, it's long been a leader in what's called digital art history and other digital initiatives in that world. And so we've had really lengthy conversations with the library trying to understand what the future may be and to try to prepare for it through providing facilities in the right places and the right kinds of rooms for that. So it's been a very interesting conversation too, because this is somewhat more speculative. I mean, there are many examples out there, but we're trying to decide what will really work for us to make this library as accessible and useful as possible.
That's great. Did you want to mention the library at all? Is there anything you're excited about in that plan?
The library is vital to do everything that we're doing, and as we are preserving the garden, the Russell Page Garden, the library has really, where the library meets the museum is really sort of the nexus of what we're doing, and it's a beautiful thing to be able to give some expression to this forward-looking institution and bringing scholarship and the museal quality together. And we always sort of say it actually comes together right at that corner. And where the garden was a place of heated discussion, it is now really very much in the center of an incredibly positive and incredibly forward-looking moment for the museum, the one moment where you can see people interact with both the house, the garden, the museum, and the library. And I'm incredibly excited about that.
I want to talk about the garden. It's a really good segue, but I also want to say that I hadn't thought of this before. I think about this where I am now. The backbone of the New York Botanical Garden is not the holiday train show. It's the research library. It's the research. No, it's what makes an institution great. It's what makes the Met great, that beautiful research library. And I can tell you, without getting mournful, about institutions where it's the first thing that goes, because they're expensive to maintain, libraries. But the fact that you're pulling your library, that you're connecting it even more to the experience of a collection and a beautiful house museum means that you're integrating. You're allowing that backbone to become even stronger. I have one other thing to say, which might sound funny though, but my very first time and most of my experience at the Frick was using the boxes of photographs. Everybody knows that there are these wonderful, wonderful boxes of photographs, but when I was studying John Singleton Copley or Gilbert Stuart, you could find them in alphabetical order if the sitters were named. But more often than that, what I loved was the boxes that were organized by men with one hand, men with no hands, women with hats. And I realize now that it's actually a Linnaean system of taxonomy, and that your boxes, Ian, are just like my herbarium. These wonderful pieces of paper that are in boxes that people have been collecting for eons and that now need to be digitized, with a facility for people all over the world to look at, women with hats, or Charles Darwin's collection
men holding microphones.
Yeah, men holding microphones.
Yeah. No,
it is the most marvelous thing, because
that circles back to the digitization. Just one minute about that. Helen Clay Frick, and the daughter of Henry Clay Frick in the 1920s, recognized that to do better art history, we needed better images. And today, when every one of us has an iPhone or device in our pocket and can summon up an image from anywhere in the world within less than a second, it's hard to imagine there was a time when you had difficulty sort of comparing a photograph of a Rembrandt in Amsterdam and a Rembrandt in New York. So Helen Clay Frick commissioned photographers to go around Europe and America. We now have 1.2 million photographs, and what librarians call metadata. I still have trouble with that word, but all the information that all the art historians have attached to the written on the back of the cardboard holders of these photographs over the years. So the Frick Art Reference Library is now working with 14 other photo archives around the world to digitize all of this, and there's something like 25 million images. And so this is a really important project, and so that in the long term, not only will it be accessible, but you can, find an image of trains in botanical gardens or men holding microphones instantly, and maybe make some meaningful use of that information.
So let's talk about the garden, which is interesting because it's outside. We've been talking a lot about inside. That's obvious. You face Central Park, which is interesting. So you're what I would call your little piece of the planet. I applaud you for holding on to it. And a lot of other people done the same thing. It's interesting when, in preparing for this, I reread, lots of things. You had taken me through it. You could correct me, but it seemed like more than anything else, when you started in this renovation plan, that garden, that tiny garden, was the lightning rod. In some ways, and just tell that story a little bit, and and what you've done to preserve it, both of you.
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, part of the plan that we had several years ago was to build on the garden site. We had actually. We're
going to expand the visitor center over, so the garden would have gone away. No. Yeah.
That plan did call for that. It also called for building roof gardens, but that's a whole other area I won't address. But there was, really a passionate outcry of many people about preserving the garden, which is one of Russell Page's last gardens, and we're a city where everybody values every square inch of grass and turf, and I understand that. And so as we have pulled back, really part of the charge to Annabelle was preserve the garden. And not only preserve it, we're looking at the original specs of Russell Page and so on, and restoring it, because it's always had certain problems. For example, it leaks into our art storage beneath, which is something that's...
Oh, that's not good.
No.
No.
So this is an opportunity to correct some of those issues.
Make it even better.
But also, take it back closer to the vision of Russell Page, because like any organic substance, it has changed over time. Trees have fallen over, or they've died, and they've been replaced, and some of the flowers that he spec'd for the space didn't actually work because it was shadier than he thought. So there are a number of issues that we want to face and try to get it back to his vision more closely.
That's great. Annabelle, are you working on the garden as well? And we have Lyndon Miller with us here today, the great garden designer who's in the Central Park Conservancy and Bryant Park, and so you're helping Ian with his little patch of and the New York Botanical Garden, of course, my perennial garden at NYBG. So you have the right team together to look at this, yeah.
We're very lucky, and not only is it, of course, a great privilege to work with Lyndon, but Barb Linder-Bell has a great deal of expertise with preservation, and also with preservation of garden areas. And it is an interesting thing, because you start out by saying, yeah, we'll just keep the garden. Like everything, it's a learning process. What each and every aspect of one such garden entails, what the intentions are, and there's been a lot of back and forth, and I sort of feel we've landed in a place that really is unequivocally making the garden as great as it's ever been. And as a result, it has become such a focal point that the architecture that rises behind where we're adding to the library is going to have, first of all, fantastic views, but also, like I said earlier, it sort of brings the mission of the Frick together with a commitment to the garden.
There's a couple more issues that I handed to Annabelle as things I wanted her to puzzle solve that I want to be sure we bring up, if I might. So one is the experience of the visitor. We talked about that more as what one saw in the galleries and how beautiful experience that is. But the other side of that is waiting to get into the Frick. So when I was walking over to TEFAF on Saturday, you may remember it was a particularly dismal and rainy day. So there weren't many people here when I got to TEFAF on Saturday. But as I left the Frick, there was a line of people in the rain. And they're there because we don't have a big enough lobby, we don't have a big enough coat room, we don't have enough bathrooms. So there's a whole side of the visitor's experience which we need to address as the audience has grown over 80 years from 100,000 a year to 300,000. Quite naturally, we simply need more resources. And one of the most critical is ADA access. And that's very difficult for an old house to solve. And Annabelle has come up with some, I think, really elegant solutions. And in the end, one of the most important parts of the design, I think, is the passage of people and art through the building. New elevators, a staircase to facilitate sort of transit through. And just if time is short, just the last thing I want to be sure that I have a chance to mention is infrastructure. So we're 100 years old, parts of the building, 80 years old, others. The skylights are often broken and panes of glass replaced, leaking. We actually had a whole session yesterday looking at different kinds of glass and ways to address that. Our heating and air conditioning systems are on their last legs. Lighting, electrical has not been updated since 1935. So all of this goes not only to sort of comfort our visitors, but the preservation of the collection. This is really, to me, one of the most critical things we can do, is to ensure the preservation of the collection through correct temperature and humidity for generations to come. And that's why we're going to have to close for 2 years, and it's very much a part of this whole design.
Well, Well, my understanding, it would be impossible and expensive and dangerous to try to do it in bits and pieces. So closing the Frick for 2 years just gives you, gives you open sway to do all that work. What you've just described is so important. It's the hardest part to fund, the least sexy of anything, and hard. I want to just ask one more question, and then we can open it to a few questions from the audience, because I know people will have. In terms of what I started to say about landmark process and how hard it is to get buy-in, you're incredibly persuasive. Incredibly persuasive, and I'm sure that, and the two of you said you're loving working with each other, but along the way, I'm sort of answering my own question. You have neighbors, community. You have what I like now to call co-creators, the staff, whose offices had too much stuff in them. You have investors, you have funders, you have policymakers, you have landmarks commissioners. Maybe just if one of you could talk about how you navigated that, or what did you do it? Did you do it together? Is what I'm interested in, because I think that's very persuasive.
Well, we do it together, but why don't you talk about that subject, Annabelle? I've been talking too much.
No, not at all. I think that, like I said, I feel that we were selected because we so deeply care about the Frick. From that position, it is important to listen to other people. And as Ian has introduced, the Frick listened and made a commitment to save the garden, and made an even greater commitment to communicate to people that what we're doing is in the service of art and in the service of the visitors. And I feel that together we've talked, we've listened, we've gone back and forth hearing what people care about, so that the intervention that we are proposing is just as subtle and just as kind as I perceive the institution to be. It's our personal endeavor to think that when the museum opens again after the renovation, that people will go around and say, well, nothing is different, it's just that much nicer. It's just that much easier to get around, it's just that much kinder, because you didn't have to stand in the rain.
I love that.
Well, Annabelle lives in the world of architecture, and I'm just visiting for a few years as a client. But it's very difficult to build, especially in a complicated city like New York, as you said earlier on. We're a landmark building, so just to quickly enumerate the hurdles that we have been over and that we still have to clear. We went before the Landmarks Preservation Commission in June, and we just received the certificate of appropriateness, so we're very pleased that they have accepted our I think, very careful design. And then we predate most of the zoning codes that this city put into place, so quite naturally we need some variances in order to be allowed to build. So we're in that process now, applying to the Board of Standards and Appeal. It's a long process, and so we expect that this will take another 9 months to a year. If provided that we get this approval, then we begin construction in early to mid 2020. We will have to vacate the premises, as we've now said several times, but I think we'll have a very interesting opportunity to show the collection at the Whitney. And then we return, if everything goes according to schedule, at the end of 2022. So that's the process as it now stands.
That's great. Thank you both so much. I think we have some time for questions, if anyone has questions for Annabelle or Ian.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Miguel Caldera. I arrived in New York in 2011, and the Frick collection was the first collection I visited. And I just want to share a brief story to corroborate what you just said, how important it is for visitors to walk around and feel somehow at home. In the living hall, where the two Albines are located by the fireplace, I don't know if you are familiar with the two Thomases, Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell. I was taking the audio tour or listening to it, and the way it was put together was so special to me, and I never forget it. And I recommend everyone, if you didn't take the audio tour, do it, because we are placed in the position of the owner of the house, looking at these two beautiful paintings, and after understanding a little bit of the author, the characters, the question is asked, which of the Thomas did Master Holbein prefer? So it's very interesting how, by looking at two paintings that look pretty much alike, with green background, same clothes, same position, you can really tell which one was the author's, the painter's favorite. So that experience really had an impact in me. I share this with all my friends who visit, and thank you for your work and for the impact that you had in me. Thank you.
Thank you. If I might just say, so the Henry Clay Frick bought those two pictures, and he sequentially, and he actually placed them on either side of the fireplace with a rather stern and forbidding image of Saint Jerome by El Greco separating them, and he was keenly aware of the relationship of those two men. So it was Thomas Cromwell responsible for the execution of Thomas More, and then of course Cromwell himself was executed by Henry VIII. And it's we also, I just want to mention, if you want to learn more, we have a book that just came out on Holbein's Thomas More in a series that we call Diptychs, in which we invite an artist or a writer or somebody to respond to a curator about a work of art in the Frick. And in this case, Hilary Mantel, who's written this series of books about, I think the third one's going to come out soon, about Cromwell, writes a letter as if writing a letter to Thomas More, and kind of really brings it to life with the point of view of a novelist that I find wonderful. So thank you.
I have a question over there.
Hi, I'm Mary Bushman. I just have two quick questions. First, because we all know, or we're so familiar with the paintings and the way they're hung on the first floor, I was curious if there's a plan yet for the second floor in terms of, is it going to be a rotating exhibition, or is it going to try to emulate what's on the first floor, like a permanent show that we'll all become familiar with? And the second question is, what's happening to the library during the renovation?
The first question, we're actively pursuing that question. In fact, before I walked over here, I was looking at plans on my desk about what will go where, and it's an interesting problem for us to have. As I said before, something like 70% of our collection's in storage, so this is the opportunity to get more out. The scale of the rooms is smaller, more intimate than downstairs, so they will lend themselves better to small-scale objects, drawings, decorative arts, cabinet pictures. So we're considering that we're making few changes downstairs. We may move some things upstairs if we think they work better there. And at this point, I can't really say any more because we really are actively working on that. And to the second question, I'm very pleased that in moving to the Whitney, we're still trying to come up with a good name for us when we're there. The Fritney and the Freuer have been suggested recently, but if anybody has a good idea, please let me know. But I'm pleased that we'll be able to continue educational programs, and we'll be able to continue library services there. The books will be off-site, but you'll be able to go online and order them the day before, and you'll be able to consult them at the Fritney.
Hello, my name is Sophie van Doornmalen. I was wondering, you mentioned the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum before, and I know that they are very limited by the will of Miss Gardner in what they can and cannot do with the space. Are you limited by the will of the Frick family as well, and did it limit certain choices you wanted to make?
I guess there's another question for me, but yes. Actually, the answer is no. We're not limited. Unlike, say, the Barnes Foundation or the Gardner that you mentioned, where everything has to stay exactly where it was placed, we have no such restrictions. We were talking about the living hall earlier. It's a room that is so perfect and so wonderfully evokes the taste and the personality of Henry Clay Frick, and is so elegantly hung that we're reluctant to ever tamper with it. So it's a kind of a baseline, but there's no strictures. We tend to, there's some things that look best in some rooms, and that's really more the philosophy of the Frick, is having a mixture of objects that speak to one another, and that fill the room in a way that makes sense, and that's elegant, and that's a visual treat.
Anybody else? Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can speak without.
Oh, better if you wait.
Okay. The Gardner has come up more than once, but also the Morgan are two of the home museums that remind me. They're very different from the Frick, but they're both elegant old home museums. Both of them, when they renovated, chose to build completely new entry areas, glass enclosed entry areas. Obviously, the Frick is not doing that. I'm curious whether that was simply a limitation of physical space, particularly not being able to encroach on the garden, or whether that was a very conscious decision not to do that.
Well, truthfully, we never thought about moving the entrance. It felt so clearly the place to enter, whether it is because John Russell Pope put it there, or whether it is because there really is no other place available. It's a little bit a combination of both. I think that you will find that the entrance hall, by virtue of the fact that it connects a little bit closer to the reception hall in its iteration, the entry hall is going to be that much nicer and that much more welcoming without really significant change. But it also allowed us to, thinking it through and seeing how changing the entrance in other institutions has maybe not been so favorable. It sort of encouraged us to make sure that it worked. And we are able to provide an accessible ramp that allows people in wheelchairs to enter through the front door just like everybody else. And so that's, I think, a really, really good accomplishment.
I didn't ask that thinking that was a better solution. I was just curious whether that was something you had.
It's interesting how often that has happened, though. I think of Brooklyn, too. There are museums that in order to preserve something about their landmark status or to provide the kind of amenities, is a word we haven't used yet. People need a cup of coffee, a bathroom, a store, an entry hall, a coat check. There are all these things that you need to do to then have a comfortable, delightful visit at a museum. And so, yes, a lot of places have done that by building on. I think it's remarkable that you figured out how to do it, within.
It was, I think, an article of faith from the beginning that we would just keep our entrance. I thought, this is the entrance that people have used for 80 plus years, and I think it just sends the message from the minute people enter the space, once we've done the renovations and additions, that it's the same space that they know and love. It just has, and they can go through the same sequence of galleries, including the living hall, exactly the way they always have. So I think it's important to signal that from the minute that people enter the building.
I want to thank you both very much. What a great project. We'll look forward to seeing it, and the openness with which you've shared in dialogue with this audience has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for moderating,
What a joy,
Carrie.
and thank you all for coming.
Thanks again to everyone. I want to add just one little thing on behalf of TEFAF New York, which is really how proud I am that we have a chance to be a small part of this conversation, which is obviously in process on a continuum about one of the great cultural institutions, not only of New York City, but of the country. So I'm very grateful. Come back anytime. Our door is always open to you. Thanks so much.